Well, good morning. It's great to be with you, and I enjoyed last night with Dear Neighbor and Neighborly Faith and the discussion that we had. Because we're immersed in a lot of politics right now in this season, and because the state of Massachusetts always has politics on the brain, I'd like to start by telling you about my own short-lived political career. When I was in the 5th grade, I ran for student council president, and in the end, I fell just short of victory. But I'd like to think that I came across well to the voters. I spoke passionately to Miss Clark's homeroom class and shook hands with my classmates in the hallways and made campaign posters with puns that seemed really witty at the time. I ran what you might call a winsome campaign. Like 5th grade me, many Christians today talk about the importance of being winsome. Some people say we should have a winsome witness, and there's nothing terribly wrong with this idea. If the alternative is being insensitive, mean, and out of touch, then let's stick with winsome. But I think we can do better. The risk with winsome is that it sounds a little too close to charm, the theological equivalent of vote for me. It suggests that we must have something about us that people will like. But the gospel is ultimately less about our own likability than it is about the God to whom we point. So instead of winsomeness, let me suggest a different approach, one that blends confidence with compassion. We can be confident in our faith and compassionate toward those who are different than us. And if you're disappointed about losing the alliteration of winsome witness, you can call it compassionate confidence. When I speak of confidence, I don't mean certainty, and hear this distinction, it's important. Faith does not mean certainty. You have believed because you have seen me, Jesus says to Thomas after the resurrection, but blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Faith without certainty is how every one of us lives in the world. As New Testament scholar Kevin Rowe observes in his book, One True Life, the human condition is such that you have to choose how to live from among options that rule one another out. And all of us make our choice trusting in things unseen. We wager our lives one way or the other. Every person, religious or not, lives and acts on this kind of faith. And that gives Christians an entry point for compassion. Whatever our differences, we all share the human condition of living and acting in faith. But Christian faith is also a confident faith. We're confident in the Word of God and in the witness of those who have gone before us. We are confident that this world is not as it should be and that there will be a day when there is no more death or mourning or crying or pain. And it's because of this confidence that we can show compassion to others. Showing this kind of compassion means that we risk something of ourselves. It means that we look for common ground with other people who are not like us. And we do so knowing that people are going to hurt and disappoint us. Leslie Newbigin puts this well in a wonderful little book called Proper Confidence, which I commend to you. Newbigin writes, personal knowledge of other people is impossible without risk. It cannot begin without an act of trust, and trust can be betrayed. Despite these risks, Christians can take the lead in pursuing common ground because our ultimate confidence lies in the gospel. This pursuit of finding common ground and of showing compassionate confidence is increasingly important in today's society, where it becomes harder for people in this country to share or to name a common good. We may hold many goods in common. We may have public goods like highways and national security, but we can't really name a common good today for this country. Something as thin as don't harm others or pursue your own identity is unlikely to hold this country together. Americans, like most citizens of Western nations today, lack agreement about the purpose of this country, the nature of the common good, and the meaning of human flourishing. And these differences affect not only what we think, but how we think and how we see the world. These aren't just abstract issues like culture and politics. They affect you and me in our everyday relationships. Think about your own reaction, positive or negative, to words like Republican, Democrat, white evangelical, feminist, capitalist, make America great again. Many of us feel strongly about these words and phrases and about the people who embody them. This is the fact of pluralism today, deep and irresolvable differences over the things that matter most. That's one reason, this fact of pluralism, why the United States is not and never has been a thoroughly Christian nation. To be sure, a white Protestant culture, or what in some circles is called Judeo-Christian culture, influenced this country's founders and shaped middle-class norms and values for much of our history. That shared culture and its assumed consensus about public morality and the nature of religious practice brought with it a number of social benefits, among them the building and sustaining of institutions and infrastructure. The vast majority of today's charitable sector, private colleges and universities, hospitals, and social service organizations, has its roots in Protestant and then later Catholic and Jewish communities. But the shared Protestant culture also failed to recognize and sometimes perpetuated significant injustices. Protestants were often indifferent and sometimes hostile toward the civil liberties challenges that religious minorities confronted. White Protestants were largely absent from the civil rights movement, and some white Protestants engaged in the personal and structural racism that exists to this day. The cultural and legal power of the Protestant culture often stifled differing views about race, religion, gender, and sexuality. Within this dominant Protestant culture, some Christians forgot the biblical counsel that on earth we have no abiding city, and we are not to place our trust in earthly princes. Over the course of generations, this culture drew some Christians toward the trappings of an earthly citizenship that obscured our deeper and our higher allegiances. While we are called to live in this world, the Apostle Paul reminds us that our proper citizenship is in heaven. In recent years, we've seen tremendous shifts in immigration, globalization, and technology that have contributed to what some people today call the age of fracture. But as the Catholic writer Joseph Bottom has suggested, the single most significant fact over the past few decades in America, the great explanatory event from which follows nearly everything in our social and political history, is the crumbling of the mainline Protestant churches as central institutions in our national experience. Whatever one thinks about the Protestant mainline, Bottom is right that it once provided the sociological and institutional framework that sustained that middle-class Protestant culture, and that framework no longer exists today. In its absence, the deep and accelerating trends toward individualism and autonomy have continued to erode trust in social institutions like businesses, government, churches, and the family. And nothing has come to replace that lost Protestant culture. Not evangelicalism, not Catholicism, not secularism. This cultural reality raises some anxieties, but it also presents us, I want to suggest, with an opportunity to rediscover Christian witness in a world that we do not control. We can learn from the biblical witness how to engage with this kind of world. The book of Jeremiah tells the story of God using the prophet to instruct the Jews in Babylon not to hate or to ignore the pagan city, but to become long-term residents in it, to exercise goodwill toward it through prayer, and to seek its peace and prosperity. They were to build up the social fabric for a common well-being. If Babylon prospers, you too will prosper. They were to be known as people who served their neighbors and their city. At the same time, God's people were not to place their future hope in social and economic improvements. They were to love and serve their earthly city, but not to forget that God would someday judge that city for all of its evils and injustices. It was only in God that believers could be sure of a hope and a future. And in this hope, instead of merely coexisting with the Babylonians, gnawed by memories of former acceptance, the Jews in Babylon were to strive for the good of their city, the growth of the people of God, and the testimony to the glory of God. Like Jews in Babylon, Christians are, and always have been, called to be resident aliens, loving our neighbors with deeds of service so that those around us will see our good deeds and glorify God. To live in this posture of resident aliens means a certain vulnerability, but it does not mean persecution. Claims that American Christians today are facing persecution sound tone deaf to non-believers and to many non-white religious believers who have long been actual minorities. This isn't to say that demographics aren't changing or to deny that some Christians in the United States face legal abuses and miscarriages of justice. They do. But it is a caution about a posture of the heart and a use of language. Whatever our circumstances, Christians are called to pray for rulers and nations. We know the love and grace of Jesus, who gave himself for us while we were yet enemies, and who calls us to serve our neighbors sacrificially, whether they believe as we do or not. So how do we begin to love our neighbors well in a practical way? I want to suggest 3 postures toward compassionate confidence from my book, Confident Pluralism: humility, patience, and tolerance. I mentioned these briefly last night, but I want to revisit them for everyone here today. Let's start with humility. Humility means knowing that when it comes to some of our most important and deeply held beliefs, we're not going to be always able to prove to others why we're right and they're wrong. This does not shake our confidence in our own beliefs, but it calls for a recognition that some beliefs stem from deeply contested premises that others do not share. People are raised differently than we are, and some transformation of beliefs are not going to happen in a single conversation. This does not mean relativism. So let me give you an example. I was once chatting with an atheist friend who seemed to relish in all of our differences. He thought it was a great thing that I liked Duke basketball, and he cheers for lesser teams, that I like mint chocolate chip ice cream and he prefers vanilla, that I believe in God and he does not. All of these things made the world more interesting to him. But his dismissal of God stopped me. Not all differences are good, I told him. We can disagree about ice cream flavors and sports teams, but Christians do not celebrate all differences about ultimate things. Humility can lead to greater empathy, but the goal is not to minimize the reality or the significance of our differences. The second posture is patience. Patience requires listening well and sticking with hard relationships. It doesn't mean blanket acceptance, and it may turn out that patient listening leads you to conclude that the ideas someone else held were just as wrong as you thought they were initially. But you can assume a posture that leaves open a different possibility, that moves beyond dismissing others before you even hear what they have to say. Patience means taking the time to learn something about the people around you. People are complicated and frustrating and wonderful, but you will only discover this with patience. With enough patience, you will find that other people, God's image bearers, almost always have something to teach you. The final posture is tolerance. Tolerance is the idea that we allow others to pursue their own beliefs and practices, even those we find objectionable. Tolerance is not the same as approval. Too many people today presume that the only way to tolerate somebody is to accept and validate everything they say and do. This is not only the wrong way to understand tolerance, it's a philosophical impossibility. Nobody embraces every belief and action as right and good. We all draw our lines somewhere. But in most cases, we can still tolerate others. Parsing this difference between tolerance and approval requires the hard work of distinguishing people from their ideas. Tolerance asks that we treat all people with respect. It does not mean we respect all ideas. Most of us are not naturally humble, patient, and tolerant. We have to practice these postures. I am a pretty snarky person by nature. I honed my sarcasm in middle school and perfected it in college. And in some ways, social media was made for a person like me. But because I've been talking these last few years about humility, patience, and tolerance, Twitter success would not be very good for my argument. And so I try to exercise care. I usually keep my tweets to rather boring expressions like, "Here's a nice article," or "Congratulations on the new job." I'm not saying I'm perfect on Twitter. I occasionally slip up. But I also write lots of tweets that I do not send. I have a private file of really clever tweets that will never see the light of day. And you can do this too with your tweets and texts and Instagram posts. It's a small step, but it's a first step. And if you accept my challenge to embrace both confidence and compassion, it may be a necessary step. Another way to pursue compassionate confidence is by connecting with others in more tangible and more vulnerable ways. That starts with ordinary acts like having a conversation or sharing a meal. And sometimes, perhaps usually, it means focusing on common interests before you delve into painful disagreements. I share a lot in common with the atheist friend I mentioned earlier. We both care about good writing, criminal justice reform, and cheap breakfasts. And we know these things about each other because even though we eventually arrived at discussing our differences, we did not begin with them. You can start to find common ground with ordinary acts in your local context. As you think through this year about what your career might hold when you leave Gordon and how you might live a faithful life down the road, don't miss the call to be incarnational with those around you right now. What are the challenges and opportunities presented by the differences you have with your neighbors? If not here at Gordon, then at home, in summer internships and other parts of your lives. Do you know your non-Christian neighbors well enough to know the challenges they face? Part of my local context, teaching at Washington University in St. Louis, is knowing that my school is also Washington University near Ferguson. And Washington University near Ferguson is linked to ongoing struggles of racial inequity and structural injustice, struggles that will only be addressed if people can begin to work across differences, black and white, city and county, Democrat and Republican, rich and poor, Christian and non-Christian. Knowing my local context means knowing the realities of the differences around me and asking how I might be called to work across those differences. Each of you has local struggles that cry out for creative partnerships across the differences that divide us. As we work to find common ground with our neighbors, we also need to tell the stories of those encounters and to encourage one another to live into the confidence we've been given through the gospel. I worry today that too many Christians in the United States have forgotten how to tell good stories. We revert instead to propositions or sound bites. But as the Gospels show us, stories can sometimes say more than even the clearest assertions. Stories can provide a kind of surplus of meaning, revealing and enriching our understanding in ways that a list of propositions, however clear, cannot do. I've been thinking about the importance of storytelling over the past year as I've been working on my next book, which I'm writing with my friend Tim Keller. Tim and I decided to write this book together when we realized we were saying very similar things to different audiences. He as a pastor and me as a scholar, he to very large audiences and me to less large audiences. But as we began to collaborate, we realized how important it was to share lived experiences rather than abstract concepts. And we realized that our work would be better if we didn't do it alone. So we invited 10 friends to join us, scholars, pastors, musicians, ministry leaders, and others. And before we began to write, we all met together in person to learn and hear about each other's stories, to push toward a project that was more collaborative than individualistic. Our book is titled Uncommon Ground, Living Faithfully in a World of Difference. It comes out in April, and I hope you check it out. We wrote it largely with audiences like you in mind, younger Christians who are looking for guidance of how to live faithfully in a world of difference. We think that one way to start is, as Paul writes in Ephesians, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another in love. One of the best illustrations I've seen of these ideas comes, of all places, from a beer commercial. I'm going to hazard a guess that I'm the first speaker in the history of convocation at Gordon to quote you a beer commercial. This particular commercial begins by introducing pairs of strangers who the audience soon learns hold vastly different beliefs about deeply important issues. The strangers, however, are initially unaware of their differences. They spend time getting to know one another in casual conversation, and then they tackle a common problem together, in this case, constructing a wooden bar on which to serve beer. And then comes the critical moment as the strangers in front of one another are shown videos of each other expressing their unfiltered and uncharitable views toward the other side. We, the audience, watch as they squirm awkwardly during the scene, and we realize the fragility of the common ground that they have established. At the end of the videos, a voice fills the room. You now have a choice. You may go, or you can stay and discuss your differences over a beer. And we, the audience, think to ourselves, this is not going to end well. There are dramatic pauses, and then in the end, against all odds, the unlikely pairings stay to talk to each other. It's a lovely example of what is possible when we start with empathy and common ground. And here's the thing. It's a beer commercial. We have the gospel. With the gospel, we can move toward humility and patience and tolerance because we are motivated by faith, hope, and love. We can assume a posture of humility because we place our faith in the faithful witness of Jesus Christ. We can have all the patience in the world because our hope is in things to come and in things already accomplished. And we can pursue tolerance because we are motivated by the love of Christ. On second thought, the love of Christ allows us to pursue something far more radical than tolerance. You and I don't just tolerate the people we love. We laugh with them, cry with them, celebrate and mourn with them. We risk the kind of personal investment that requires more than just coexistence. And even when people reject us or are hostile to us, we have an answer there too. Jesus doesn't say to tolerate our enemies. He commands us to love them. And thank God that he does not merely tolerate us. He embraces and loves us across the greatest difference of all. Christians should be leading the way of engaging with confidence and compassion because we are called to embody the love of Jesus that he has shown to us. We are called to go into those uncertain and messy spaces. That means taking risks and stepping outside of comfortable relationships. Some people may cast aspersions on you for the company you keep or the places you go, and that's okay. They did that to Jesus too. Jesus, of course, responded with truth and love. He did not, I would like to suggest, settle for winsomeness. And this makes sense. Jesus wasn't trying to win a fifth-grade election. He wasn't trying to avoid hardship or condemnation. He wasn't trying to fit in with others. Jesus had bigger plans to restore the created order to right relationship with God. And today, he invites those of us who are his followers to join him in that work of redemption and reconciliation. We can begin to do this with both confidence and compassion. And so may you, Gordon College, be people who speak and act in the world with humility, patience, and tolerance, because your thoughts and actions are characterized by faith, hope, and love. Thank you.